Some recipes are meant to nourish. Others are designed to kill. Tonight, I'm taking you to Harmony, Vermont, where the town's most beloved baker turned her kitchen into a chamber of death, one sweet treat at a time. Picture this. It's November 1962, and every Thursday afternoon for 8 years, the women of Harmony's Maple Street have gathered at Dorothy Whitman's pristine colonial home for tea, gossip, and her famous German chocolate cake. Dorothy is everything a 1960s housewife should be. Immaculate hair, spotless apron, and a smile that never falters, even when discussing the most scandalous neighborhood secrets. But when 3 of Dorothy's closest friends die within 6 weeks of each other, all after enjoying her homemade desserts, the town's new doctor begins to suspect that Dorothy's recipe box contains more than just flour and sugar. Dr. Patricia Hayes will discover that behind Dorothy's perfect facade lies a methodical killer who's been serving death disguised as kindness, using her neighbor's deepest secrets as seasoning for revenge. The investigation will reveal that Dorothy Whitman wasn't just the neighborhood's favorite baker. She was its most dangerous resident, turning afternoon tea into the last supper for women who dared to threaten her carefully constructed world. But which secret was worth killing for? And how many more victims were already on Dorothy's guest list for next Thursday's tea?
Welcome back to Golden Age Mysteries, where America's darkest secrets refuse to stay buried in small-town soil. I'm your storyteller, and tonight we continue our Small-Town Secrets series with a tale from Harmony, Vermont, a picture-perfect New England town nestled in the Green Mountains, where maple syrup flowed as sweetly as the gossip, and where everyone knew their neighbor's business a little too well. In November of 1962, John F. Kennedy was still president. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and American housewives were embracing convenience foods and modern appliances. But in Harmony, population 3,800, tradition still reigned supreme. Homemade pies cooled on windowsills, neighbors borrowed cups of sugar, and a woman's worth was often measured by the lightness of her biscuits and the richness of her pound cake. Harmony had been founded in 1791 by Puritan settlers seeking religious freedom, and by 1962 it embodied everything Americans idealized about small-town life. Main Street was lined with elm trees and white picket fences. The high school football team was undefeated, and crime was limited to the occasional drunk driving incident or teenage prank. It was the kind of community where reputation mattered more than money, where a family's good name could be destroyed by whispered gossip, and where social standing was determined by inclusion in the right circles, which made Dorothy Whitman's Thursday afternoon tea gatherings the most coveted invitation in town.
You know, as I research these stories from 1960s America, I'm always struck by how the most innocent traditions can hide the darkest secrets. The sharing of recipes between neighbors, afternoon tea gatherings, kitchen conversations. These were the rituals that held these communities together. But they also created perfect opportunities for those with hidden agendas. This got me curious about you folks watching tonight. Drop a comment and tell me, do you have any family recipes that have been passed down through generations? Any culinary secrets that only your family knows? And most importantly, would you trust accepting a homemade cake from a neighbor you barely know? Because after what happened in Harmony, Vermont, I'm pretty sure you'll think twice before accepting that invitation to your perfect neighbor's afternoon tea. Share your family stories in the comments below. I promise I won't use any of them against you. Dorothy Whitman was, by all appearances, the ideal American housewife. At 34, she had moved to Harmony in 1954 with her husband Robert, a successful insurance salesman who traveled frequently for business. Their colonial home at 247 Maple Street was a showcase of domestic perfection. Manicured gardens, spotless interior, and a kitchen that could have graced the cover of Better Homes and Gardens. But it was Dorothy's baking that truly set her apart. Her German chocolate cake was legendary. Her apple turnovers brought grown men to tears, and her Christmas cookies were so coveted that women would compete for her recipes. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of exactly what each person craved. The perfect amount of sweetness, the ideal texture, flavors that somehow triggered childhood memories of maternal comfort. Dorothy had a gift, remembered Helen Patterson, one of the few Thursday tea regulars who survived. She could look at you and somehow know exactly what kind of dessert would make you happy. It was almost supernatural how she could read people's tastes. What Helen didn't know was that Dorothy's gift wasn't supernatural. It was methodical research combined with careful observation and an encyclopedic knowledge of her neighbors' private lives. Dorothy had moved to Harmony with secrets of her own. Her husband, Robert, wasn't just a traveling salesman. He was a bigamist who had married Dorothy while still legally wed to a woman in Albany, New York. Dorothy had discovered the truth 6 months after their wedding, but instead of confronting him or leaving, she had chosen a different path. She would build a life so perfect, so enviable, that losing it would destroy him. But perfection, Dorothy learned, required constant maintenance, and in a small town where everyone watched everyone else, that maintenance often meant eliminating threats to her carefully constructed facade. Dorothy's Thursday afternoon tea gatherings began innocently enough in the spring of 1955. What started as informal coffee with a few neighbors gradually evolved into Harmony's most exclusive social event. By 1962, an invitation to Dorothy's Thursday tea was considered the ultimate mark of social acceptance. The regular attendees were the cream of Harmony's female society: Margaret Foster, the bank president's wife; Ruth Coldwell, who ran the town's most successful dress shop; Evelyn Pierce, married to the high school principal; and Sarah Morrison, whose husband owned the largest dairy farm in the county. These women controlled the social fabric of Harmony: who was invited to which events, whose children got the best opportunities, whose families were accepted into the inner circle. Dorothy studied these women like a scientist studying specimens. She learned that Margaret Foster was desperately trying to conceive after 3 miscarriages, that Ruth Caldwell was skimming money from her business to pay gambling debts, that Evelyn Pierce suspected her husband of having an affair with a young teacher, and that Sarah Morrison was secretly drinking herself into oblivion to cope with her son's death in Korea. Each woman's vulnerability became an ingredient in Dorothy's recipe for control. She would offer comfort at exactly the right moment, provide solutions that seemed miraculous in their timing, and gradually position herself as indispensable to each woman's emotional survival. But Dorothy's system had one fatal flaw. It required absolute loyalty, and in the fall of 1962, 3 of her closest friends made the mistake of questioning Dorothy's methods. But which woman made the first move against Dorothy? And how did a recipe for German chocolate cake become a recipe for murder? We'll find out After examining the first mysterious death, Margaret Foster was the first to die, though at the time, no one suspected murder. On October 15, 1962, Margaret collapsed during the Thursday tea gathering, convulsing violently before losing consciousness. Dr. Patterson, the town's elderly physician, attributed her death to a sudden heart attack, unusual for a healthy 31-year-old woman, but not unheard of given her history of pregnancy complications. What the good doctor missed was the bitter almond scent that Dorothy had carefully masked with vanilla extract in Margaret's personalized portion of German chocolate cake. Margaret had been served a fatal dose of cyanide, delivered in the one dessert Dorothy knew she couldn't resist. Margaret's death had been carefully planned for weeks. During the previous month's tea gathering, Margaret had made a casual comment that would seal her fate. "Dorothy, I've been thinking about that insurance policy Robert sold me. Something doesn't seem right about the beneficiary information. Maybe I should have someone look into it more carefully." Dorothy realized that Margaret's investigation could uncover Robert's bigamy and destroy everything she had built. Margaret Foster, the woman who had been trying so desperately to start a family, had to die to protect Dorothy's secret family. The funeral was everything Dorothy could have hoped for, a tragic celebration of a young life cut short, with Dorothy positioned prominently among the mourners, offering comfort to Margaret's grieving husband and accepting condolences for the loss of her dear friend. But Margaret's death was just the appetizer. Dorothy's main course was already being prepared.
3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, Ruth Caldwell began experiencing strange symptoms. She complained of severe stomach cramps, nausea, and a metallic taste in her mouth that wouldn't go away. The symptoms always seemed worst on Thursday evenings after Dorothy's tea gatherings. Dr. Patterson attributed Ruth's illness to stress from running her dress shop, but Dorothy knew better. Ruth was being slowly poisoned with arsenic, administered in tiny doses through her favorite lemon meringue tart, a dessert Dorothy had created specifically for Ruth's refined palate. Ruth's crime had been greed mixed with suspicion. As the town's primary seamstress, Ruth had access to every woman's home, often working fittings in their private bedrooms. During one such visit to Dorothy's house, Ruth had noticed something odd in the master bedroom. 2 different sets of men's clothing in different sizes, as if 2 different men lived there. When Ruth casually asked Dorothy if Robert had lost weight recently, Dorothy recognized the fishing expedition for what it was. Ruth had always been too observant for her own good, and her gambling debts made her potentially desperate enough to use dangerous information for profit. Ruth Caldwell died on November 8, 1962, after 6 weeks of gradual poisoning. Her death was attributed to stomach cancer, aggressive and swift, just the kind of tragic illness that struck without warning in small-town America. Once again, Dorothy was the perfect friend, organizing meals for Ruth's widower and handling funeral arrangements with characteristic efficiency. She even delivered Ruth's final dress order personally, ensuring that her friend would be buried in style. But Ruth's death attracted the attention of someone Dorothy hadn't counted on. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the young physician who had recently joined Dr. Patterson's practice.
Dr. Patricia Hayes was everything Harmony wasn't used to in 1962. A young, unmarried woman who had chosen career over family, who drove her own car, and who asked uncomfortable questions that challenged conventional wisdom. She had arrived in Harmony 6 months earlier, fresh from her residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, bringing modern medical knowledge to a town that still relied on folk remedies and wishful thinking. When Dr. Hayes reviewed Ruth Caldwell's case files, several inconsistencies jumped out at her. Ruth's symptoms didn't match typical stomach cancer progression. Her blood work showed unusual mineral imbalances, and most significantly, her illness had followed a very specific pattern tied to weekly social activities. "I've seen arsenic poisoning before," Dr. Hayes confided to Sheriff William Crawford. "During my residency, we had several cases from industrial accidents. Ruth's symptoms match perfectly: the metallic taste, the gastrointestinal distress, and the gradual organ failure. Someone was slowly killing her." Sheriff Crawford was initially skeptical. In Harmony, suspicious deaths were usually accidents or natural causes. The idea that someone might be deliberately poisoning the town's most respectable woman seemed absurd. But Dr. Hayes was persistent, and her medical credentials were impeccable. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes requested permission to examine Margaret Foster's body. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Margaret Foster had been murdered. But before Dr. Hayes could share her findings with Sheriff Crawford, Dorothy Whitman was already planning her next victim, and this time the target was someone who knew too much about everyone's secrets.
Evelyn Pierce had always prided herself on being observant. As the principal's wife, she felt responsible for knowing what was happening in her community, who was struggling, and who might need help. It was this natural curiosity that made her both valuable to Dorothy's social circle and ultimately dangerous to Dorothy's survival. During the weeks following Ruth's death, Evelyn had begun connecting dots that others missed. She noticed that both Margaret and Ruth had died shortly after Thursday tea gatherings. She remembered that both women had seemed unusually tired and unwell in the weeks before their deaths. Most importantly, she recalled specific conversations where both women had expressed concerns about Dorothy's husband, Robert. On November 20th, 1962, Evelyn made the mistake of sharing her suspicions with Dorothy directly. During what would be her final Thursday tea, Evelyn pulled Dorothy aside and expressed her concerns about the recent deaths. "Dorothy, I know this might sound crazy, but I've been thinking about Margaret and Ruth. Don't you think it's strange that they both died so soon after having concerns about Robert? I mean, what are the odds?" Dorothy's response was perfectly calibrated, just the right amount of shock, concern, and gentle dismissal. She suggested that grief was making Evelyn see patterns that weren't there, that tragedy sometimes came in clusters, and that perhaps Evelyn should focus on her own family rather than dwelling on such morbid thoughts. But Dorothy had made her decision. Evelyn Pierce knew too much and was too intelligent to be distracted for long. She would have to be eliminated before she could share her suspicions with anyone else. Evelyn's death was Dorothy's masterpiece of misdirection. Instead of poison, Dorothy chose a method that would appear completely accidental: a severe allergic reaction to nuts, something Evelyn had suffered from since childhood, but had learned to manage carefully. Dorothy had spent weeks researching Evelyn's allergy, learning exactly how much exposure would be fatal and how to disguise the allergen in a way that would seem like tragic accident. Her weapon of choice was her famous carrot cake, which contained finely ground walnuts mixed so thoroughly into the cream cheese frosting that they were virtually undetectable by taste. Evelyn died that evening at home, suffering anaphylactic shock that her husband initially attributed to accidental exposure during a school event. It was only when Dr. Hayes examined the scene and tested samples from Dorothy's carrot cake that the truth became clear. But by then, Dorothy had realized that her perfect system was falling apart. Dr. Hayes was asking too many questions, Sheriff Crawford was starting an official investigation, and the Thursday tea gatherings had been suspended indefinitely. It was time for Dorothy's final, most desperate gambit.
Dr. Patricia Hayes had become Dorothy's most dangerous enemy without even realizing it. Her modern medical training, combined with her outsider's perspective on Harmony's social dynamics, made her uniquely qualified to see patterns that longtime residents had missed or dismissed. After confirming that all 3 women had been murdered, Dr. Hayes began reconstructing the killer's methodology. She discovered that each woman had been targeted with a different poison delivered through their favorite desserts: cyanide in German chocolate cake, arsenic in lemon meringue tart, and ground nuts in carrot cake frosting. The killer clearly had intimate knowledge of each victim's preferences and vulnerabilities. "This isn't random," Dr. Hayes explained to Sheriff Crawford. "Someone studied these women, learned their habits, their fears, their secrets. Someone who had regular access to them and could predict their behavior with deadly accuracy." The investigation revealed Dorothy's motive gradually. Margaret's husband confirmed that his wife had been investigating Robert's insurance policy. Ruth's assistant at the dress shop remembered Ruth mentioning suspicions about Robert's personal effects. Evelyn's husband recalled his wife's concerns about the pattern of deaths. All 3 women had discovered or suspected Robert Whitman's bigamy, and all 3 had died before they could act on their knowledge. But when Sheriff Crawford went to arrest Dorothy on November 28, 1962, he found 247 Maple Street empty. Dorothy had vanished, leaving behind only a spotless house and a recipe box filled with what appeared to be ordinary dessert recipes. It was Dr. Hayes who cracked Dorothy's final code. Hidden within Dorothy's collection of seemingly innocent recipes was a sophisticated record-keeping system that documented not just ingredients and measurements, but also her neighbors' secrets, weaknesses, and ultimately, their methods of elimination. Each recipe card contained multiple layers of information. The visible recipe was genuine. Dorothy's baking skills were real, which had made her poisoning method so effective. But written in lemon juice invisible ink between the lines were detailed psychological profiles of her targets. Margaret Foster's German chocolate cake recipe included notes about her fertility struggles, her husband's insurance business, and her dangerous curiosity about financial matters. Ruth Caldwell's lemon meringue tart card documented her gambling debts, her access to other women's homes, and her excessive attention to details that don't concern her. Most chilling was the discovery of recipe cards for women who were still alive. Sarah Morrison's apple pie recipe contained notes about her alcoholism and her knowledge of neighborhood affairs. Helen Patterson's chocolate chip cookie card included observations about her husband's business dealings and her potential for spreading rumors. Dr. Hayes realized that Dorothy had been planning a systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten her secret.
with each murder disguised as either natural death or tragic accident. She wasn't just a killer, Dr. Hayes observed. She was a social predator who used baking as both camouflage and weapon. Her kitchen was a laboratory for studying human behavior and administering death. But Dorothy's disappearance wasn't the end of the story, because someone else in Harmony had been keeping secrets about Dorothy Whitman, and those secrets would lead to a final confrontation that no one could have predicted.
The manhunt for Dorothy Whitman led Sheriff Crawford to Albany, New York, where he hoped to find Robert's first wife and learn more about the couple's history. What he discovered there would reframe everything about the case. Robert Whitman had indeed been married before moving to Harmony, but not in the way Dorothy had believed. His first wife, Linda Whitman, had died in 1953 of what appeared to be food poisoning after a romantic dinner Robert had prepared for their 5th wedding anniversary. Detective James Riley of the Albany Police Department had always suspected Robert in Linda's death, but had never been able to prove murder. He was smooth, charming, devastated by his loss, the perfect grieving widower. But something about that case never sat right with me. When Riley learned about the murders in Harmony, the pattern became clear. Robert Whitman was also a killer, and Dorothy had unknowingly married a man who shared her methods and her ruthlessness. The investigation revealed that Robert's frequent business trips weren't for insurance sales. He had been systematically moving from town to town, marrying wealthy women, killing them after gaining access to their assets, and then disappearing with their money. Dorothy was supposed to be victim number 4. But Dorothy had discovered Robert's pattern before he could complete his plan. Her move to create the perfect life wasn't about hiding from his bigamy, it was about turning the tables on another killer. She knew exactly what he was, Dr. Hayes realized. The Thursday tea gatherings, the social prominence, the careful documentation of everyone's secrets, it was all insurance against her own husband. She was building a fortress of respectability that would make her too visible to kill quietly. But Robert had been playing a longer game than Dorothy realized.
On December 3, 1962, Dorothy Whitman returned to Harmony under cover of darkness. She had been hiding in a tourist cabin 50 miles away, monitoring the investigation through newspaper reports and radio broadcasts. But she hadn't returned to surrender or flee. She had come back to kill her husband before he could escape. Dorothy found Robert at their house, calmly packing his belongings as if preparing for another routine business trip. The confrontation that followed was recorded by a hidden microphone that Dorothy had installed months earlier, another layer of her elaborate security system. "I know what you are," Dorothy's voice came through clearly on the recording. "I know about Linda in Albany, about the others. Did you really think I was stupid enough to be another victim?" Robert's response was chillingly casual. "I wondered when you'd figure it out. You were always too smart for your own good, Dorothy, just like the others." "The others?" Dorothy laughed bitterly. "You mean your wives or my friends? Because I've been protecting myself from you for 8 years, Robert. Every Thursday tea, every recipe I perfected, every secret I collected, it was all to make sure you couldn't make me disappear quietly." The recording revealed that both Dorothy and Robert had been aware of each other's murderous nature for years, locked in a deadly game of mutual assured destruction. Dorothy's social prominence made her too visible to kill without investigation. Robert's frequent absences and carefully maintained alibis made him difficult to frame for murder. But the arrival of Dr. Hayes and the exposure of Dorothy's crimes had upset their deadly balance. Now both killers were desperate, and only one could survive.
The final confrontation between Dorothy and Robert Whitman ended not with murder, but with mutual destruction through confession. Both killers, realizing that their deadly game had reached its end, chose to ensure that their opponent couldn't escape justice, even if it meant their own capture. Dorothy's hidden recording system had captured not only their final confrontation, but also months of Robert's phone calls, arranging his escape routes and discussing his previous victims. Robert, in turn, had kept detailed financial records of Dorothy's poison purchases and victim research, planning to use them as leverage if their arrangement ever collapsed. When Sheriff Crawford arrived at 247 Maple Street, he found two of America's most methodical killers sitting quietly in their perfect living room, surrounded by evidence of their crimes, waiting to be arrested. The trials that followed captivated the nation. Dorothy Whitman was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Robert Whitman was extradited to New York, where he was convicted of his first wife's murder and eventually linked to 6 additional deaths across 3 states. Dorothy served 18 years in the Vermont State Prison for Women before dying of cancer in 1980. She never expressed remorse for her crimes, maintaining until her death that she had been protecting herself and her community from dangerous people. Robert was executed in New York State in 1965, one of the last men to die in the electric chair before the state temporarily abolished capital punishment. His final words were reportedly, "Dorothy was the only one who ever understood what I was."
The revelation that Harmony's most perfect couple had been engaged in a deadly game of mutual destruction sent shockwaves through the small Vermont community. The Thursday tea tradition ended permanently, and many residents struggled to trust their neighbors' kindness in the same way again. Dr. Patricia Hayes became something of a local hero, but the fame was bittersweet. Her modern medical knowledge had solved the case, but it had also revealed how easily trust could be weaponized by those with murderous intent. The most frightening thing about Dorothy Whitman, Dr. Hayes reflected years later, wasn't that she was evil, it was that she was so good at being what everyone expected her to be. She understood the social mechanics of small-town life better than anyone, and she used that understanding to kill. The house at 247 Maple Street remained empty for 3 years before being sold to a young family from Boston. They renovated extensively, removing Dorothy's kitchen entirely and converting the space into a family room. The recipe box that had contained Dorothy's murder plans was donated to the Vermont State Police Museum, where it remains on display today. Sarah Morrison, one of the intended victims whose recipe card was found among Dorothy's plans, moved away from Harmony within months of the trial's conclusion. "I keep thinking about all those Thursday afternoons, how she would watch us, listen to us, learn our weaknesses. Every kindness was really reconnaissance for murder."
The Dorothy Whitman case became a landmark study in criminal psychology, demonstrating how social camouflage could be used to hide systematic murder. Criminologists noted that Dorothy's method, using genuine domestic skills to conceal deadly intent, represented a particularly sophisticated form of serial killing. More disturbing was the realization that Dorothy's victims had been chosen not randomly, but specifically because they posed threats to her secret. Each woman had been eliminated not in passion or madness, but through cold calculation designed to protect Dorothy's carefully constructed life. She turned the most basic social bonds, friendship, hospitality, community support, into weapons, noted Dr. Martin Webb, the psychiatrist who interviewed Dorothy during her trial.
She understood that people's trust in domestic normalcy was their greatest vulnerability. The case also highlighted the importance of modern medical knowledge in small-town America. Without Dr. Hayes's expertise and willingness to question conventional wisdom, Dorothy's murder spree might have continued indefinitely, with each death attributed to natural causes or tragic accidents. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Dorothy and Robert's deadly marriage wasn't unique. FBI investigations following their arrests uncovered similar cases across the country. Couples who had found each other through mutual recognition of murderous intent, creating partnerships that were both romantic and homicidal.
And so concludes another chapter in our Small Town Secrets series, where perfect facades can hide the most imperfect souls, and where the people we trust most with our vulnerabilities might be the ones most willing to exploit them. The Dorothy Whitman case of 1962 reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it comes disguised as kindness, served with a smile, and a perfect recipe for disaster. Dorothy's recipe box sits in that Vermont museum today, a testament to how ordinary objects can hide extraordinary evil. Visitors often comment on how normal the recipes look: perfect handwriting, practical ingredients, detailed instructions for creating delicious desserts. It's only when you know the full story that you understand how those same cards documented the systematic study and elimination of human beings. The women of Harmony eventually resumed their social gatherings, but they never again trusted quite so completely in the kindness of neighbors. Dr. Hayes continued her practice there for another 30 years, always remembering that her willingness to question conventional wisdom had saved lives. And the house at 247 Maple Street became home to a new generation who filled its rooms with laughter instead of deadly secrets. Join us next time as we explore another forgotten corner of small-town America, where trust can be the most dangerous ingredient in any recipe, and where the most ordinary people can harbor the most extraordinary capacity for evil. Until then, remember that true kindness never comes with hidden agendas, and that sometimes the most perfect neighbors are the ones you should watch most carefully.